All right, it's 4 o'clock, so I'm going to get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's Keck seminar. I'm very excited to kick off this series of talks on innovation and diversity in biomedical sciences and to learn what it takes to attain excellence in research, mentoring, and leadership. So on that note, today we have with us Dr. María Cárdenas. She is the R&D Associate Director from Becton Dickinson, and she is leading the efforts on clinical microbiology, research and development. Dr. Cárdenas received her doctorate in molecular virology and microbiology from Baylor College of Medicine and completed her fellowship in medical and public health microbiology at UPenn. She then went on to become the assistant professor of pathology at UPenn and served as a director of infectious disease diagnostics laboratory at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. She is very passionate about working with diverse teams towards a common goal for patient care. Dr. Cárdenas has served on numerous committees, and most recently, she was the recipient of the highest R&D recognition at BD, the Wesley J. Howey Science and Technology Award for Operational Excellence. So today, she will share with us her unique journey and lessons learned from a rewarding non-linear career. Most importantly, the challenges she overcame and the impact mentorship has had in her career growth. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Dr. María Cárdenas.
Thanks so much, Varuna, for that great introduction. And thanks everyone for coming here today on a Friday, even though Karen was telling me she still takes attendance. But thank you for being here. Thank you for showing up. I really have structured this as more of a conversation. So I encourage everyone on the line to participate. If you have questions, actually I saw David on there. Thanks, David. Hey. So I will try and manage chat, but good to see you. But yeah, I encourage just conversation. So if something comes up and you're like, oh, I want to talk about this, your own experience or thoughts, please weigh in. I've tried to make time for a lot of just discussion and questions as well. So not worries if we don't get through all the slides. It's really more about having this discussion with all of you today. So I'll get started. First of all, I just wanted to say, let me see if the slides are working. Okay. Okay, cool. I think we got it now. So first of all, thank you. Thank you to the organizers for really creating this type of forum that can highlight innovation and diversity. I appreciate that in the biomedical sciences. And like I said before, thank you for coming to this discussion today, because it really is a discussion. And so of course, as a scientist, I need to start with data. And I am a female and I'm Hispanic. And so I wanted to give some data pertaining to that. You can see here on this graph, specifically, well, there's Black, Hispanic, Asian, but this is a graph from a Pew Research Center publication from April of this year, looking at data from 2019. And you can see that specifically Hispanics were underrepresented in STEM workforce at only 8%. And then there's the breakdown of the different STEM fields. Just to keep that in mind, the majority of those are also men and not women. In addition, of course, we all know that women in STEM continue to earn significantly less than their male counterparts. And so again, just food for thought as to how do we need to continue to change this. I think a lot of work has been done towards it, but there's still a wide gap. You see here Asian men versus white men, then Asian women, and the top or the bottom three are white women, Black women, and Hispanic women in that order. And I wanted to just start by saying that knowing this information and kind of knowing that across racial and ethnic groups, women in STEM earn less, that has helped me when I'm having discussions about fair market value for myself, discussing promotions, discussing bonuses, and ensuring that I am valued fairly in the workplace. And so I've had times where I've said, hey, you know, having those conversations about a new position, and I've gotten shown the tier of the range of salaries that I'm in, because I have asked for that, and I said I want to ensure that I'm getting fair market value. So that has really empowered me to have those conversations, which are not easy to begin with. So just keep that in mind. I think a couple of other food for thoughts, specifically towards Latinas and women in STEM, they hold less than 3% of STEM jobs. Many, this is men and females that are English not as a first language, may face language barriers that affect confidence. Imagine, not speaking your native language or not having a native language be English and then having to also explain scientific concepts or items that are not necessarily easy to you in the first place. That can definitely affect your confidence when you're having to give a lecture or a talk or have a conversation about a career option. Was also not have a lot of role models and mentors to relate to. I can say in my years, I've had two true Hispanic females, Latinas actually, that I've considered mentors that are outside of Colombia, of course. So that kind of speaks for itself. And then also finding resources may not be easy or even know where to start, right? I have never Googled like Latinas mentors or things like that. And so finding kind of those groups where you could have resources for some isn't easy. I do have to say that I try not to go on too much of Twitter or those kinds of settings because I start to compare myself and then I get kind of down and saying, oh, maybe I'm not as successful as I thought I was. And so those haven't worked for me. Maybe they've worked for you. If they have, please chime in and weigh in. But I find myself sometimes when I go onto Twitter that I'm just doing the comparison game and I try to avoid it as much as possible. So just food for thought there. And then the last bullet point of having machismo or sexism, especially in Latin culture, where there's a strong, assumptions of the role of a woman versus a man. Again, this is changing, but I think it's still pretty prevalent. And also talk about gender bias, right? So when, females need to prove it and prove it over again to ensure that they are or be seen as confident or walking that tightrope, right? Where you are too feminine to be confident or too masculine to be likable. So you kind of get backlash of displaying those stereotypically masculine behaviors. And so you have to kind of walk this fine line of not being one, not being two of the other, or else not being able to get promoted necessarily. So more just food for thought. And I'll discuss some of kind of my journey and stories of things that I've experienced throughout my career and this path. And again, please feel free to share your experiences as well, because this is an open forum. So please remember today that success is deeply subjective and we are each on our own journey to define it for ourselves. I consider myself successful in many different aspects and I don't feel that success is just one checkbox, right? You can be successful at different stages of your career. So just keep that in mind as we go through the presentation today. So a little bit about my journey. I'm originally from Bogotá, Colombia. I got my bachelor's degree in microbiology at the Universidad de los Andes. And then I went to do an internship at the National Institute of Health, or the Instituto Nacional de Salud in Bogotá. This gave me my first kind of experience into public health world, which is where I would later kind of end up in. And at that time, I knew I wanted to get a PhD, but my own bias was that I didn't believe that getting a PhD in Colombia would be beneficial because I thought no one would take it seriously. What does a PhD in Colombia mean? And so I myself had that bias and I said, all right, I want to go to the United States where I can get my foot in the door and get a PhD there. And so while I was at the NIH in Bogotá, some of the lessons learned that I wanted to just point out was that hard work really paid off. I didn't get a ton of publications from that work, maybe one several years later, but I did have some strong female leaders in the public health lab that were role models for me. Dr. Isabel Castañeda and Marilyn Hidalgo, which she is shown here. I could not find a picture of Dr. Castañeda to put on the slide. But they saw my work ethics day to day. And then through their networking, they were saying, hey, do you know of someone that may be working in the United States that could support possibly a trainee or a visiting scientist? And through their network, by way of seeing my hard work, talked to Dr. Gustavo Albuena. This is an individual that I have only met probably a handful of times in my life. And he actually vouched for me to someone at UTMB to then get me a visiting scientist position. So I wanted to just call out that you really never know the impact a stranger can have on your life. I definitely hadn't really even thought about it before. But if it wasn't for him, I probably would have not made that kind of switch and entry into the US to be able to then continue my career. At this time, because it was an unpaid position, I had to ask my father to say, hey, can you help support me in the United States for 6 months? I promised him that I would either get a paid job after 6 months, or I would probably return to Colombia and likely end up working for a company anyway at that time. So just think about kind of how doors open and the impact that people can have, not just within your own network, but in their networks as well. So as I went to Galveston, I first asked myself, where on earth is Galveston? Jerry McBride, he was the one that opened his lab to me being able to come in and be a visiting scientist there. But I had no idea where Galveston was. I had to Google it, and I found out it was kind of an island somewhere in Texas. And I showed up my first day with 2 bags, actually one, because one got lost on the flight. And it was hard. It was hard to be, a Colombian who's lived with her parents her whole life through college, and then come to a new country and a new place. I don't know if any of you have experienced that. If so, please share in the chat, shout out. But yeah, it was not easy to have that shift. But I knew what I needed to do it to get a PhD, which is what I wanted to ultimately do. And so I started working in Jerry's lab. And as a visiting scientist, there were some challenges and lessons learned. I think the first one was I realized that I was doubtful in my training. Again, my own biases of, a Colombian, how is this my bachelor experience compared to someone that did their education in the United States? And I found out that, hey, it's actually not that different. I was pretty equal when it came to, education and background. And so I gained confidence in myself. I also learned about protein purification and cell culture. I worked with Ehrlichia, and for those of you that don't know Ehrlichia species, they are bacteria that are intracellular, so you can't grow them on petri dishes. You actually need cell culture for them to be able to grow. Also, hard work definitely pays off. In 6 months, I got 3 publications, and one of them was my first author, but understand I had no friends, I had no family, I was basically living in the lab. And also, I would say that if it wasn't for Dr. Kyler Doyle, who was a postdoc at the time in UTMB, I'm not sure where I would be. So he really, at the beginning, was very, don't touch my things, right? You're a postdoc, you want to get those publications out, and here's someone coming in from Colombia, like, oh my God, she's going to ruin everything I've done, right? So, he started to trust me, he saw my good work. And then I actually shared my story and said, hey, Kyler, I'm looking for a position. I need a paid job to move forward to be able to stay. And so again, kind of that person going out of their way into their network to say, hey, do you know of someone that may have a lab tech position? So he got his PhD at Baylor College of Medicine as well. And so he kind of reached out to his BCM network. And that's how I found my next position. So thanks, Kyler, for everything. And so I went to BCM. I started as a lab tech in Rick Lloyd's lab. I think they were paying $32,000, I think, at that time as a lab tech. It was my first paid job. I was ecstatic. And so I moved to Houston, again, new city, same country. And I started working in Rick's virology lab. And this was one of the articles that we published. It was my first and only cell-hosted microbe. So just to tell you, it's not that I have many cell-hosted microbes or nature papers for that matter. I think I have one and one. But again, kind of the firsthand and the importance of having a mentor, but also a sponsor. And so the difference between kind of mentorship and sponsorship is, the mentor that is there teaching you, how to do the science, right? How to think about problems kind of on a day-to-day. But a sponsor is kind of there where, is in the room where it happened when you're not, right? And so they're saying, hey, I know this person, vouching for you, those kinds of things. And so it's important, I believe, to find mentors and sponsors throughout your career. For sure. And the second bullet point that I wanted to just call out was, continuously reassessing your interests and your path, right? I had the courage to choose the non-obvious path. It would have been more obvious to just stay in Rick's lab and get my PhD with him since they already had been in his lab for a year, but I kind of was drawn to antimicrobial resistance, and I wanted to do more things with that than with viruses. So I actually joined a different lab, and being able to do so. Was it the right path? Well, I would say so, because here I am, but you had to make a choice and move forward. And I see Ilan commented here that he also attended Universidad de los Andes and also moved from Bogota to College Station. So yeah, it's tough, Ilan. Thanks for sharing. I do appreciate it. It's not easy. So after I got into grad school, I joined Tim's lab, and I got a PhD. Well, I went to get a PhD in molecular biology and microbiology. And as you all know, it does take a village to get a PhD. And so these are just some of the people, because I could fill probably this whole presentation with all the people that made an impact, but I just wanted to call out certain individuals like Mary Estes as, a strong female voice in the department, that really kind of, it was on my committee, so I still hear her voice sometimes when she would give advice in journal club or things like that. Joe Petrosino connected me to someone that was really key for future, and I'll talk about that in a different slide. Scott and Gil were really instrumental in just reviewing my applications, giving me advice, feedback when I was writing letters and things like that. And then of course my husband, Chris Nobles, which I met in grad school. So you kind of never know where life's going to take you. Now, would I say that my PhD was all great and all the experiments? No, who's really does that? And so I actually took 5 months off during the second year. I think I had just joined Tim's lab. And I remember coming into his office and saying, so Tim, I'm going to take 4 to 5 months off to go travel through South Korea on a martial arts demonstration team. Do I regret it? Not one bit. I think that was just a great experience. I think people thought that I was taking a leave of absence, I wasn't going to come back to get my PhD, but that was never really my intention. I just had an opportunity to travel through South Korea. And I said, when am I ever going to take this or have this opportunity again? And so I did it. And so kind of just saying, hey, if you have opportunities, take your chances. Your PhD can wait a little bit sometimes. Also leveraging the medical center network during the PhD. If you're in the med center, you have so many things just right at your fingertips, right? If your institution doesn't have something, you just cross the street and there's another institution that I bet has it. And so I would just say, I really took advantage of the medical center network and tried to leverage that as much as possible. And then I learned from my PhD what I definitely was not good at or did not like doing. So I was surrounded by great scientists, really amazing people, and they loved crystallography. They loved that programming and figuring out things. And quite frankly, I just was not cut out to doing that, but that was my PhD. So during my time in Tim's lab, I published 2 papers, the 2 that you see here. One was on CTXM, so extended spectrum beta lactamases. CTXM is one of the most widespread ESBL enzymes, and they offer resistance to extended spectrum cephalosporins. So this is kind of what I had thought that I would really enjoy, was that antimicrobial kind of susceptibility testing and figuring out what makes these enzymes so special. And so for this one, yes, I did some, site mutagenesis, site-directed mutagenesis on some of the active site residues, and I showed that they in fact do promote expansion of the active site to accommodate for cefotaxime. For the second paper, we were looking at orogidine monophosphate decarboxylase, or ODCase, which is a very highly proficient enzyme. And so the hypothesis was that basically evolution of this proficiency may be linked with very high stringent sequence requirements of amino acids near or at the active site. And so I again did randomization of 24 residues around the active site. And interestingly enough, we found that they were quite tolerant to substitution with only modest drops in catalytic proficiency. So those were my 2 publications. And I have to say that I was ecstatic to not see another crystal structure or have to do some work in Python ever again. There were people that were much better at that than me. And so I knew that that was just not my career path. Now, others in the lab, yes, they flourished and they become really amazing scientists in that field, but that was just not for me. So if anyone here is saying, wow, yeah, what my PhD is about is just not where I want to go in my career, that's okay. And you know, just stick to what you need to do to get your PhD, and then you can shift your career for something that aligns more with what you're looking for. So some of the challenges and lessons learned, you know, it's not all about the publications. I had those 2 publications from my PhD, and sometimes I felt like it really seemed like the publications was like, if you don't publish, you're not really worth anything, and that's, I don't think it's true. Of course, you need them to probably graduate, but again, it's not that significant throughout your career in the end, I would say, looking back. I saw myself as getting a PhD as a stepping stone and not the end goal. And I thought that also helped when there were days that things just didn't work out. It's saying, okay, I have more to do and I have further to go. And then I also leaned on the network that I had built to find other opportunities that aligned more to the career path that I was looking for. And so again, reaching out to the network and the people that I had. And so I knew I wanted to have a career that had to do with interacting with patients and kind of having that somehow making a difference in patients' lives, but I really didn't know what that was. And no one really at BCM that I had talked to could kind of put me in touch with something that looked even remotely similar to what I was looking for. But Joe Petrosino actually suggested that I reach out to Paula Ravel, who was at the time the director of the Texas Children's Hospital microbiology laboratory. And I also, you know, when I went to conferences like ASM, I participated in those networking opportunities. So I literally, like, there's a breakfast for non-academic career tracks, and I would go there. And at one of those, I actually sat down next to a table, or at a table next to Dr. Nishamkin, Irv Nishamkin, also shown here, which ended up being my boss and the next step of my career. So I would just say that, you know, never underestimate the importance of an email and a cup of coffee. I had reached out to Paula and say, hey, Paula, this is who I am. I'm a PhD student in this lab, and I'm really interested in understanding what you do as a clinical microbiology lab director. Do you mind getting a cup of coffee? And she goes, no, let's go to the Commons, get a cup of coffee. And that really kind of got me hooked into clinical microbiology. And then with Irv, it was the same way. He was a lab director, and I was trying to understand what he did on a day-to-day. And at the end, I think it really did help that he knew me face-to-face to then get a position at Penn. So again, you know, if you're doubting, should I send that email? Should I reach out? Go for it, do it. You never know the doors that can open for you looking at those opportunities and opening for your career. So at this stage, I applied for some clinical microbiology fellowship positions. And I went on to be a clinical microbiology fellow at the University of Pennsylvania. These are 2 individuals that led the program in addition to Irv Nishamkin, so Dr. Edelstein and Dr. Hodenka. And right now they are both in retirement, but they really were, they became family basically in being sponsors, as I said before, and being mentors. And again, you've seen that many of the people that I have on these slides are men. There will be women coming up. Yeah, it really spoke to me about building your network, right? And really using those connections that you have to find kind of those next steps in your career. And so as a clinical microbiology, I don't know if many of you know what clinical microbiologists do. If you do, please put it on the chat. But I just wanted to kind of talk a little bit about what clinical microbiology is and what we do. And so as a lab director for clinical microbiology, we either work in academic environments or public health labs usually. Academic environment means, you know, hospitals that are connected to a university. And kind of, so you teach on the university side, but then you have your responsibilities on the hospital side. You wear many hats. So you look at the diagnostic assays used for patient care at your hospital setting. So for example, someone comes in with a fever and they get a blood drawn, it's sent to your lab and you're incubating it to see if the patient has an infection. You get to kind of decide what instruments you should put in your lab to be able to detect bacteremia. You can also do or advise on new technologies. So, every year new products are coming out, and so you can say, hey, that one's an interesting one that's come out. Let's bring it into the lab and let's evaluate its performance and see if it's something that we would want to purchase. We also get to do your own research, clinical research. And you may get funding from clinical trials or other grants. That was important for me. I did not want a career where I had to be writing grants all the time. I saw how people, really, really dedicated a lot of their time to spending late nights writing grants and all of that. And that was just not for me. And I knew that I wouldn't be able to compete with people that didn't sleep because they wanted to or they had to write their grant. And so I just knew that that wasn't an option. So I wanted to stay in academia, but not necessarily have to depend on that funding on a day-to-day basis. We also teach. We do a lot of teaching at the university. That's your university appointment, of course, and then mentorship as well. And we get to interact with a lot of different clinicians every day on patient care questions, diagnostic stewardship questions, looking at antimicrobial stewardship programs, infection and control, et cetera. So there's a lot of communication that goes on. So you need to be someone that, is a little bit of an extrovert in the sense of talking to many different types of people every day. And you also get to see some fun bugs in it once in a while. So if you're a little bit squirmish, I would say probably look away from this next slide. But here are some of the organisms that you get to see in a clinical lab. So here on the left is Mr. Fettuccini, and this is a Tenia. You can get this from ingesting raw or uncooked meat from cattle and pigs, depending on the species. In the middle is a schistosoma, a myristidia from a urine sample from a patient. This is a blood fluke. And it enters the human host through the skin. You can usually get fever, cough, abdominal pain, diarrhea. Pretty cool stuff. And then here on the right is a blood smear from a patient that has malaria. And so if you see within the red blood cells, you can see these little kind of circles in a darker purple, if you will. Those are the parasites inside of the red blood cells. And so depending on how many parasites there are, the shape of those circles, if they're intracellular or extracellular, it tells us the species of the parasite. And so, we're not just doing PCRs and kind of the things that you hear for COVID diagnostics these days, but you also get to see, fun things like these. So just wanted to share a little bit about what clinical microbiology is about. And so when I kind of when I finished my fellowship, then you start your interview process of saying, okay, where do I want to go? And so you again have to reassess and continually ask yourself, do I want to go into a hospital? Do I want to go into public health? And what are the opportunities? And so I actually ended up staying at Penn and at CHOP. My primary appointment was director of the actual clinical virology lab is where I started at CHOP, but then I had a professorship appointment at the University of Pennsylvania. And so Bob Domes was the chairman of the department when he was the one that hired me. And this is a picture of the lab. So it was 16 full-time employees when I joined. And that's something just to keep in mind, right? If you have a passion to be a mentor and to maybe have a lab, being a lab director, you're wearing many hats. And so if you have opportunities for gaining experience for mentorship, for leadership in your current role, I highly encourage you to take those because you're really going to use those skills. The science is kind of the easy part. It's the human interactions and all of that gets a little bit messier as well. So if that's something that interests you, I really encourage you to get opportunities to learn about those as well. And so that was the first lab. Some challenges and lessons learned that I kind of have from this piece was, sometimes opportunities appear where you're not looking, right? I ended up actually staying in the place where I was, but I didn't know if that was where I was gonna end up. I had to continuously reassess the next step. So did I want to go into pediatrics versus adult hospital setting, or versus in a setting where you do both adult and pediatric? Did I want to go into clinical virology as opposed to clinical microbiology, which, you know, you see parasites and you see different types of bacteria, as opposed to saying, oh, I only want to do virology. And so at this stage, because I started in pediatrics and because I started in a clinical virology lab, many would have thought that it was a really limiting my career opportunities. They say, oh, no, you got to start, you know, broad, and then you slowly start to kind of come together. But in my experience, this was actually the opposite. So having a small community within a larger field was exactly what helped me boost my career and grow professionally. So it was the opposite of limiting in my case. I really enjoyed that small community feel, and it gave me kind of more connections than what I could have imagined at a larger field. So for example, we had meetings that were couple hundred people instead of a big ASM meeting that is thousands of people. And so I started to get different types of mentors. These two ladies, Alice Valsamakis and Christine Ginocchio, who were lab directors at the time. Now they've both moved to industry. But having made those connections, and as a kind of like a young scientist saying, hey, I want to build my network and get those connections, having a small community within the clinical virology field helped me do that easier. So again, that's where I say, you know, you don't know what opportunities may appear when you're not looking. And so think about those options as well, I would say. So what kind of studies are done in a clinical microbiology lab? I'm not going to go into a lot of details of what they are. We can talk about papers and types of publications if you're interested in during the second half, but I just wanted to kind of give you an idea in case you're interested in considering a career in clinical microbiology. What we do, we evaluate new technologies, like I mentioned before. So usually these are comparative evaluations, and you want to publish this to let other people know that maybe considering that similar technology. So we can say, hey, we have this instrument and we're going to want to bring on this other instrument. Does it perform the same or different than what we already have for your patient population? We also do investigations on the performance of existing technologies in special patient populations. So again, I worked in a pediatric hospital, and so many of the instruments were for adult patients. And so I had to say, okay, does the instrument perform the same for a pediatric patient? And then off-label use of existing assays or platforms. There are instances where pediatrics uses the same platforms, but they are off-label uses of those. One is, for example, for HIV, many of the platforms are only tested in adults, thankfully, because we've been able to reduce the amount of a neonatal HIV. And so having to show that those platforms actually are also adequate for the pediatric population can be difficult for companies to do. And so being in a pediatric setting, we needed to do that. Also, prospective evaluations of products not yet on the market. Maybe a company has an idea and they want to pick your brain on what you think about it. So you get to do some of those interesting studies. We always have interesting clinical cases that you get to publish on or collaborate on, where your lab or the instruments that you used crack the case, if you will. And so that's always fun to write. And then, of course, laboratory developed tests, more so in the era of COVID. A lot of labs have had to do that. But depending on your hospital setting or your institution, you may or may not get time to do more laboratory developed tests and research in that setting. The other piece that I want to say is, you start to make a work family. And I wanted to highlight these three ladies because they've been very, very special as a family, right? Tracy, I worked with her, and just someone to just connect with and bounce ideas off of at work is extremely important. Esther Babari is a role model. She works in New York, and just kind of seeing her career path led me to want to kind of follow in her footsteps. Diana Cajon is one of the two individuals that I had mentioned before. She is from Argentina. She worked at a completely different institution than the one I worked in. But she immediately took me under her wing and was like, let's publish together, let's do things together. And so I got several publications in collaboration with her. And so that was something that just was really, really special. And so, my work family extends throughout the country. And again, unexpected mentors and sponsors. I did want to make a pause here to really highlight coaching opportunities. So sometimes in my career, I found people saying, oh, well, if you need a coach, it means that you're just not ready, or that you have issues, or you're not, something is wrong, basically. And I have to say that I had a coach. Her coach was Winnie, and she was essential to my personal and professional growth. And I would say that if you have the opportunity to have a coach, take it. It was just amazing. The things that I learned from Winnie that I probably would have learned, but it probably would have taken me longer and harder to do so. So if you get a chance in the role that you have or your next role to say, hey, can I get a coach? I would highly encourage you to do so, because that was one of the best things I think I have done for my career. So a couple of just stories of experience with bias, since we're talking a little bit about just challenges in throughout career. The first one was unconscious assumptions, right? So when you're in the lab and you have a lab coat, you kind of blend in, at least I do. And so when people would come to the lab that weren't familiar with the team, they usually look for the oldest, either female in the group, because many of us were female, or the male. They really wouldn't come in and say, hey, who is a lab director that I need to speak to for X, Y, or Z? And so I think not once did anyone actually turn to me, because everyone assumed it was either the lab manager who is an older female, or one of the male counterparts in the lab. So every time someone had to turn around and say, this is Dr. Cárdenas, and she can help you with that. Story two, there was a time that I was on a committee, and I realized that I had been chosen to be on the committee because I was a woman and a minority, and that a counterpart of mine, a colleague, had not been chosen to be on the committee because she was a woman and she was white. And that, of course, was very infuriating for both of us, because we both felt like, well, they were just putting me on there to check a box, and she wasn't getting it because she wasn't me, as opposed to, thinking of, oh, we want this person's opinion. We value what she has to say on this committee. And so one of the things that I did was I made sure my voice was pretty heard on that committee. But again, kind of those experiences, right, that leave kind of a bitter taste, if you will. And then I would say, day to day, though there are some stereotypes, right? Oh, you don't like spicy food. Oh, how well do you speak English? It's incredible. Do you like tequila, right? Which are sometimes silly, but at the same time, it's like, okay, how do I address this, right? And so we'll talk a little bit about that later on in the presentation. If you have any stories you want to share of experiences, please chime in. I don't need to read your name if you want to share it just with me, but I think it's important to share with others as well. That's what I'm doing today. So at this time of my career, I was continuously again reassessing what fulfilled me. I had checked the box of getting a PhD. I had checked the box of going to get a fellowship. I had checked the box of being a clinical laboratory director. That was my dream job. And now I was like, okay, so what's next, right? I've been doing this for several years now. Where am I going to go? And I started to ask myself what I loved and what I did not love about my current role. I can say I was on call 6 months out of the year. I hated that. I had a son at home at the time, and I just didn't love bathing him and then getting a page and then having to call my husband, hey, can you finish giving him a bath because I need to take this call. So those were things that, it was just other priorities in my life at the time. I looked more at what I wanted to be doing rather than a job title. And I would say that's especially important if you're considering careers in industry, where you can read all of these kind of job titles. And they may sound the same, but they can be very, very different. And so first trying to define what is it that you want to be doing rather than I want to be a director or I want to be a X can be more helpful. And of course, I also considered my family, right? Choosing a different job could mean relocating, and it actually did for us. And when you're having to consider your partner as well, and possibly a child at the point, yeah, it's a lot to think about. I have someone here that shared that they never get identified as an Argentinian because she has near perfect English and they look white. So yeah, she also sharing that she had the same kind of biases to doing a PhD in the US because again, what is there from a PhD in a South American country? So again, and thank you. She's saying that I'm an example. So appreciate the comments. I'm glad you can relate. You're not the only one. So after this, like I said, I kind of reassessed, okay, where am I in my journey? And I decided to leave academia. I think some people would have thought I was crazy, right? I'm leaving an Ivy League institution. I am leaving being a lab director of a clinical infectious disease diagnostics laboratory in what I would say is the #1 children's hospital in the nation. Some would argue it's #2, but I'm not biased. For a different path. And so I went into industry. I think 10 years ago, someone had said, oh, you're gonna end up in industry. I would go, no way, no way. And here I am. So I started as a senior manager in microbiology and research and development. And I recently moved to a new position as associate director, still in research and development, but for larger solutions and not just the microbiology side that I was looking at. And so what do we do in industry R&D? Well, we get to tinker. You can get patents. You can still get publications. There's opportunities to educate and share your domain knowledge. I was brought in because I had that clinical microbiology expertise. So that's something that I would say, if you are looking to go into industry and apply, what differentiates you from all the other applicants, right? I can tell you, I see a ton of, resumes or CVs. I do PCR, I do molecular, okay, but tell me, what is it that you do differently that all these other candidates don't have, or what would you bring to the table? For me, it was that clinical microbiology expertise. I was a customer before I joined Becton Dickinson. And so I could bring that customer perspective into the development of products. And so yes, we impact the entire product development process. We are research and development, but we also help support the products that are already on the market. And I would say that BD is a company that always is having that customer perspective at the end, right? We know that our products are going to hospitals, going to, patient care settings. And that was something that spoke really to me when I was looking for jobs, right? You have to kind of find that fit in your gut. You're interviewing, and the institution is also interviewing you, and you need to kind of figure out, is this the right choice for what I'm looking for or not? And we also do customer interactions, have scientific discussions, et cetera. So it's pretty dynamic in R&D field. This is some of the people, and I just wanted to highlight these 3 individuals because, again, you can find your mentors and your sponsors anywhere. So make sure to find yours wherever you go. Celine is a mentor and a sponsor. She was one of the people that was one of the reasons why I went to BD. Craig was my previous boss, and he was a huge mentor. And Patrick is a sponsor at a VP level in industry. So again, you can find mentors and sponsors wherever, not only in academia or in certain settings, they can be really anywhere. And then these are some of the lab members. This is a small portion of them. But again, getting to work with just really great people and amazing individuals has been super, super exciting for me, at least. So if you're thinking about industry, and if you're thinking about what you want to do in industry, and I'll get to someone's question in a minute, I would say consider what role or what type of role interests you. Again, asking yourself what fulfills you. So more than the title, is what do you want to do? I would say in industry, there's individual contributors, which are kind of your technical experts, your problem solvers. They're usually people that are kind of in the lab, reviewing data, all of those kinds of things. And then you have, looking at clinical trials or maybe customer evaluations, very hands-on problem solvers, thinking about things like that. And then you have your other side where is the management track, where you have a more strategic approach. You're defining the what of the team. You find satisfaction in growing others. So you are responsible for the career progression of others on your team. And you get things done with and through others. So there's a lot of kind of working through influence. And so when you're looking at careers, you can ask yourself, okay, am I more on the individual contributor track? Or maybe I am right now, but I want to move towards the management track. What opportunities do I have to then get more expertise or experience in management so that when I do apply, I already have some experience there. Someone here asked, was it a problem that my education wasn't specifically in clinical laboratory science? So it wasn't a problem necessarily. I think some people do have that as their background. So after my clinical fellowship, I did actually have to take the boards of medical microbiology. So I did have to sit through an exam and take that, and that's what the DABMM at the end of after my PhD means, is that yes, I had to get board certified. Many institutions, if you want to be a clinical laboratory director, will require you to at least be able to have that certification if you don't already, if you haven't already passed the boards in medical microbiology. And then at the time of the fellowship application, what was your visa status? Yes, I find it hard to find fellowship scholarship applications for internationals. That is very true. I was actually quite lucky because I had recently gotten married. So I had recently obtained a green card. But I understand that doesn't happen for everyone. And that was something that, yes, right before that was happening, I was having to look to see what programs, what were the options for people that didn't have or weren't either residents or didn't have a green card or were on a working visa or a student visa for that matter. So yes, I hear you there. They are harder to find for sure, and I can imagine with COVID probably even harder still. Yeah, but great questions. Thanks for posting. I would say that kind of just like a pause here, knowing your own strengths and cultural preferences will help you better create the career options that are a true fit for you. So talking a little bit about, I want to make sure we have a couple of minutes left, kind of what can we do to change the narrative? And so again, have courage, speak up and point out unwelcoming events. I remember that there have been some times where I've walked into a conference room, and I did this not only in industry, but I did it also in academia where there would be a large table and I'd walk into the room and I'd sit on the sideline. Why? I don't know. I just sat on the sideline. Why didn't I sit at the table? There was no delineation of these are the people that should be sitting at the table. And so I tried to then change that and start sitting at the table more often. And maybe I would see a colleague or someone and I'd be, hey, come on over here. Let's sit at the table together. So that's one of the things that I just kind of thought about when I was putting the presentation together. Another one is, speaking up for others that may not speak up for themselves. So for example, if you're at a meeting and one person says an idea and another person says probably the exact same thing or maybe adds a couple of items to it, but then everyone is like, oh yeah, great idea, second person. And being able to speak up and say, hey, second person, I really like what you added to the point that first person made earlier, right? So again, kind of speaking up and pointing out those events will help change the narrative and will help to start to kind of like, oh yeah, that's right, it was the first person that actually brought that to the table, not the second person. So think about ways that you can do that. There was also one time where I was at a customer site and one of my colleagues was introducing everyone, and Dr. So-and-so, here's Dr. Murray. Dr. So-and-so, here's Dr. So-and-so, here's Anna. Like, well, I'm a doctor too. So I'm not sure why they had introduced me as Anna. And so I talked to the person afterwards and I say, hey, you know, I have a PhD and my last name is pronounced Cárdenas, like a car, Cardenas. And I asked them to please introduce me as doctor if they're going to be using that for everyone else. And so just again, speaking up, you know, and letting them know like, hey, take this into consideration. If we speak up, then I really do think we can start changing that narrative. And maybe it takes more than one time to say something, but I feel like that's better than not saying anything at all. Volunteering, I saw someone else up, I'll get to you in a minute. Volunteering and leaving an impact and becoming a role model, opening doors and leaving them open. So again, kind of what I'm doing right now is sharing my experience, sharing my obstacles with all of you. And I do like to volunteer in things that I feel is important. I volunteer for the Pan-American Society for Clinical Virology, but I also, there's a group here called Adelante Latina in Baltimore. And so I would say take some time to volunteer. Someone asked, can you share your thoughts on the importance of soft skills and how to develop a fluid skill set to ease transition from bench science to industry? Yeah, that's a great question. I think practice is one, and getting opportunities to use different types of skills. I think also there are opportunities in industry when you can come on board as a trainee, for example. And so those can be great career kind of boosters as well. So there's, you know, especially at BD, you finish your PhD and there's what they call a TLDP program where you can submit applications, and it's a 3-year kind of program where you can go through different sites and different settings. And you learn more about company, about industry, and you're trying to figure also what interests you. So if that's something that you're interested in, I would say look into those opportunities as well, because those will also help the transition between the bench and industry. And so some of the take-home points, because I did want to leave time to have discussions. We have 8 minutes. You know, guide your career. Your career does not guide you. So just remember that. Know your strengths and interests, and spoiler alert, these are going to change. They've changed multiple times for me, and I'm sure they're going to change for you as well. Understand your priorities. Use your network. I highlighted multiple times during presentation today how my network and people outside of my network really influenced my career. Volunteer, meet face-to-face. I know it's hard now, but if you get a chance to go to that conference, you know, don't just focus on the poster you're presenting, but really go up and talk to people, do the breakfast thing, do the dinner thing, whatever it is to get your face in front of others. I mentioned this before, it's not all about the title, company, position, but really ask yourself what fulfills you. What do you want to be doing in the next step of your career? What does that look like? Change is okay, and it's guaranteed. So, you know, nothing to do there. And then opportunities are endless, but also be patient. You know, sometimes you just need to let things kind of take their course. So leave you with a quote. This is my family. This was, I guess, last month in the Appalachian Trail. And so thank you again, everyone, for being here today. And please ask questions, comments, raise your hand, chime in. This is really open for discussion. Thanks. Hope everyone's awake and not asleep. Come on, it's a Friday. Someone, anyone.
I don't really have any questions, but thank you so much for the talk, Anna. I mean, I guess I'm curious about maybe work-life balance as a clinical microbiologist.
Mm-hmm. I would say that, so I started without having a son. So, you know, I did work longer hours, probably not too long, but, you know, there wasn't that rush to get home or pick up someone at school. That definitely changed when I had my son. In clinical microbiology, like I said, I was on call for 6 months out of the year. So it was one month where my colleague had call and 1 month where I had call. And at times it was a little crazy, where I was taking, I had a pager go off at 2 in the morning, at 5 in the morning. So that was stressful. That I think depends on the institution and depends on where you are. And also depends on your connections with the faculty and the clinicians, right? ID and things like that. So I think it really depends. I think right now with COVID, it's a completely different story, right? There's been a lot of burnout. People are tired because of all the testing and the diagnostics that have to been going around with COVID. In industries, it was the same way. I mean, I was already at BD when this happened, and yeah, a lot of long days. But at the same time, in industry, 5 o'clock on a Friday, if you go look at BD on Google, it says closed. I can close my computer. I'm at home. There's no expectation that I'm going to be looking at emails or replying on a Saturday or Sunday, unless my boss says specifically, hey, I want you to do this, which was different than the academic setting or a hospital setting where you were probably checking your email at least a couple of times a day, even over the weekend, just to make sure you didn't miss anything. If that helps, Miranda, with your question, or Miranda. Anyone else? Thoughts, comments? Someone asks, what do I think is next for me in my career? Sky's the limit, right? That's a great question. I mean, I just recently transitioned into a new role, which was overseeing a larger piece of the solutions or the instruments that we have at BD. And so I think having that kind of larger influence on the products that we have was the next step for me at this stage. It's a little bit more into the informatics portion of things. And so now I talk to developers as to before I would talk to engineers. And so now I'm starting to hear again those C++ and R, and oh boy, it's bringing me back to my PhD Python days. So I guess some things do come full circle. But I think I've always liked to influence people. And so my role in industry is more management. So I do have a group of individuals that I help with career progression, and that's very important to me. And so as long as I can keep doing that, I think I will feel that fulfillment of growing others and move through that. Someone is saying here, industry is usually thought of as fast-paced. What does that mean in your point of view? Yeah, it's fast-paced in a different way, in that it's more of a marathon rather than a sprint, is what someone kind of describes it as. And so when you're developing a product, right, you kind of have this vision in a year or something to get it through FDA clearance and approval. And throughout that process, you have a lot of like small milestones or large milestones that you need to accomplish, right? And so there could be various deadlines along the way that you need to kind of fulfill, right? To then at the end say, okay, we're ready to launch this product and take it to market. So that I think would be fast-paced in that, yes, you have to kind of keep yourself to those goals that you and your team have set. I would say it's a little bit slower paced in that taking a product to market takes a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, as opposed to when I was a lab director in academia, I wanted a product and I could say, hey, I want to purchase this, you purchase it and you put it in your lab, and a couple months later you're rolling with it. So I think it's kind of that that balance of yes, it's fast paced because you do have the milestones that you need to ultimately take your product to market and of course make it a business. That makes sense. Any other questions, thoughts, comments? I do want to say to everyone that, you have my name, look me up on LinkedIn, shoot me a message. I'm open to chatting, having a conversation. Again, please connect. If you're shy in this bigger audience, please go ahead and do so. There's one more question. Your thoughts on how to find sponsors or support systems along the way? Yeah, I think sometimes you kind of just fall into a sponsor or a mentor, right? Without really noticing, you kind of just meet someone. And I think it's having that courage to say, hey, would you be my mentor? Would you be my sponsor? I think sometimes just setting that clear direction and not just, hey, let's go have coffee. And then it's less formal, but telling someone, hey, I really think that you're a great role model. I love what you've done in this space. Would you be open for mentoring me, or would you be open for us to have a one-on-one on a regular basis, or things like that, right? A more structured kind of thing. I think sponsors are more kind of, they see you and they're kind of like, okay, I want to vouch for this person. And so it's just kind of portraying those pieces of who you are and what you want them to highlight, and also helping them see it. So for example, this is an example that, sometimes you're walking in a lab, or you're walking in the hallway and someone stops you and says, hey, great job on that. That was really good. Thanks for doing X, Y, or Z, right? How do you capture that? That's someone is giving you feedback that what you did was awesome and it changed something, right? And so something that I've tried to do is I send them an email back and say, hey, so-and-so, thanks for the feedback on blah, 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 that you gave me the other day. Appreciate it. And then I keep those emails. And then that way, when, it's time to get promoted, or I want some, I'm like, hey, look, these are all the people that said, these are great things that I have done, that you can't really capture any other way, because it was just the hallway conversation, the 5-minute here. So kind of being able to do that, I think is also a great way to, sponsor yourself in a way. That makes sense. All right, I think that was all. I know we're out of time.
Thank you so much. This is an amazing talk full of useful advice and insights. I'm sure everybody enjoyed the talk today. So thank you, Dr. Cárdenas, for being here, and hope to see you all next week. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.